Hi everybody, I'm Scott Stewart with UT Extension, and today we're part of the Pollinator Tour, and we're really going to specifically try to zero in on trying to mitigate the negative impacts of agriculture and in particular pesticides on pollinator health.
Tell us why pollinators are so important.
Well, you know, there's all kinds of pollinators. There's bird pollinators, bat pollinators, but the thing you're hearing the most about, of course, is the bee pollinators, and probably the number one bee you hear about, of course, is the honeybee, and of course they have a lot of importance. The honeybee was brought over to this country really to improve production of vegetable crops, because many of those vegetable crops require pollination. Also, those pilgrims that came over wanted a source of honey, and bees are a good source of honey as well. So that's economically important, right? We raise bees, we pollinate crops, they provide value to the crops, extreme value in some cases, and they also provide food and other products, beeswax, there's all kind of things that they provide to us, and that's specific to the honeybee. But I think there's other reasons they're important too. First of all, these bees are part of our natural ecosystem. Even though the honeybee is not native to the United States, there are lots of pollinators that are native to the United States, and they all have roles in pollinating all these wildflowers. There are some flowers and plants that can't exist unless they have their specific pollinator. So they have a huge ecological role in the environment, not just to things we grow, but the natural vegetation that's out there. So I do want to make the point that bees are very important pollinators, and I think a lot of people are familiar with some of the crops that have to be pollinated, things like the melons. The almond production's a big deal. You know, they cart thousands of bees and bee colonies out to California and places they grow almonds to make sure those crops get pollinated. It's big business for the beekeepers, but it's also big business for the farmers. We do need to recognize that a lot of the crops that we grow in West Tennessee, our primary field crops, don't require pollination, don't really benefit from pollination. Things like cotton can be pollinated, but mostly it crosses itself. Soybeans the same way. Corn is wind pollinated. Wheat is wind pollinated. So a lot of the crops we're growing, the major field crops, don't really need pollinators. However, they are important habitat for those pollinators, and they're at risk. Those pollinators are at risk when they forage in those crops if they get sprayed with pesticides, for example.
We hear a lot about honeybee health. What do you think people need to know about honeybee health?
Well, and of course there's other speakers on this tour that are going to address this probably in more detail than I will, but I can tell you one thing: honeybee health is complicated. Honeybee keepers are struggling right now to keep their hives alive, and trust me, I keep bees now, and it is a challenge to keep these hives going long term. I think you have to recognize that the honeybee is really kind of livestock. You'll hear people talking about bees are going to disappear in a year, all the honeybees are dying. The reality is we have just as many honeybee colonies, if not more, in recent years than we've had in the past. The challenge is they're having a harder time maintaining these bees. Part of the problems is these bees have their own pests. For example, varroa mites, and there's diseases. Varroa mites, an invasive that got introduced a number of years ago, and it's probably the major threat that's facing honeybees right now. It feeds on the honeybee, but it also transmits diseases, a number of diseases into the colonies, and they have to treat for it with pesticides, otherwise eventually most of these hives will die. So diseases of their own are really a challenge for these honeybees. Management's a big issue, and a lot of the problems that are being experienced or get the most, I guess, publicity are the management issues that these big beekeepers have. I mentioned people are trucking sometimes hundreds or thousands of beehives out to crops that require pollination, and it's a real challenge to manage those bees and move them around. Anyhow, it's even more challenging when you got to worry about those diseases. I think we have a lot of part-time beekeepers that also are not good at keeping bees, and because of those diseases, it really requires you to be on your A game. You have to manage the diseases, you have to feed the bees as needed during certain times of the year when there's not good nectar or pollen flow. So, you know, that's an important thing. So another issue we see with the pollinators is habitat availability, and I think that one's probably not talked about enough, but people recognize it. And in fact, we're standing in front of a sign that's signage for a pollinator plot that you'll see here in a minute or two, but there's some people putting some effort into providing good forage habitat for pollinators. If you think about it, when you get in an intensive agricultural area, there's not a lot of native vegetation in some of these areas, and so the bees are very reliant on the crops themselves for a resource. And those crops can provide a very good resource for honeybees, for example, but one of the challenges is a lot of these crops are very temporary, right? They bloom for 2 or 3 weeks, sometimes not even that long, and then the food dries up and there's nothing else out there for the bees to feed on. And that creates some stress on the bees, and stress is not good. It causes management problems.
So would you agree that pesticides are really getting the most attention when we talk about pollinator health?
That's absolutely the case, and I think it's probably not deserved, to be honest. I think most of the beekeeping experts will tell you that some of the other problems, like varroa mite, are probably the primary problems, but it's a contributing factor, and it's something we need to be aware of. And of course, if you're following the social media, you hear a lot about pesticides, in particular insecticides, of course. And if you really want to Google stuff and look at all the social media bickering back and forth, they mention the neonicotinoids insecticides in particular. They get a lot of attention, and again, I think a lot of that, based on some of my research, is undeserved. But I think we need to recognize, as managers of crops that are applying insecticides and other pesticides that could negatively affect the environment, including the pollinators, we need to manage for that and mitigate those risks that those pollinators are being exposed to. So when we're talking about pollinator health, and today I'll talk a lot about honeybee, but it goes beyond the honeybee. There's a lot of different pollinators, and we're standing in front of this essentially a food plot for pollinators, and there's a whole mix of different flowers in here, and they're not all designed for honeybees. They're designed to support pollinators of all different kinds. So keep that in mind, but I think also you can keep in mind that things we do that reduce the risk of causing damage to honeybees probably benefit the other pollinators that are in the system. One of the reasons we focus on honeybees is because they are a commodity. There's people that are actually monitoring their hives, and when they have issues with hive health or a pesticide kill, they know it because they're aware of it.
Do some crops pose a higher risk to pollinators than others?
Yeah, that's a good question, and I think it's pretty intuitive. You know, we have some crops that have very low insecticide inputs. We also have some crops that the bees don't spend a lot of time in. Wheat's a good example. You know, you don't see a lot of honeybees in wheat. It may be a pollen source in some circumstances, but it's not very attractive. Corn's kind of the same way. Bees will forage in corn, but they won't spend a lot of time in it. First of all, really all it does provide is pollen. It's not their favorite kind of pollen, but the way the corn crop grows, it only provides pollen for a week or so, so it's a very short-lived resource. So it's not a big risk factor in those crops just because they don't spend a lot of time in those crops. The other thing about corn and wheat, as another good example, is they don't get sprayed a lot with insecticides or pesticides in general. Now you take a crop like cotton, which is attractive to more and different kinds of pollinators, and over a longer period, because they're blooming, there's a bigger risk. In fact, the EPA's designated it as a high-risk crop because it's attractive to pollinators, and it's frequently sprayed with insecticides because we have some significant pest issues in cotton.
You've done a lot of research on pesticide residues. Talk a little about that.
Yeah, there's a couple of things I'd mention on that, and you know, one of our recommendations is for people when they're spraying in high-risk areas, let's say you're spraying next to some beehives, is to try to make those applications late in the day, and that's based on a couple of things. One's the behavior of the honeybee. The honeybee tends to forage starting very actively in mid-morning during warm parts of the day, and then as it gets closer to evening, say 6 o'clock at night, they kind of start closing up shop, and they spend less time out there foraging. So if you can spray later in the day, you're less likely to catch those bees while they're out foraging on that crop. There's some crops that the blooms don't even remain attractive during the whole day. So those of you that grow pumpkins or melons of some kind probably know that those flowers open up in the morning, and by midday they're closed up and the bees no longer have access to them. So if you spray in the afternoon, those bees are not going to be directly exposed to the pesticides. They're only going to be exposed to the residues when they come back the next day. Cotton's kind of similar. Cotton blooms for one day, but it has a number of blooms over a number of weeks. But that bloom by the end of the day is really closed up and bee activity is greatly diminished. The other thing that we've seen with foliar applications is, you'll see some graphs probably up on the screen, is those pesticide residues actually diminish pretty quickly. You know, we've did some data, actually the data was collected last year in cotton and soybean. I think the graphs you'll see will be on cotton, where we pulled samples an hour after application and then 24-hour intervals after that. And you see a pretty dramatic reduction in pesticide residues in the first 24 hours in most cases. There's some pesticides that break down more quickly than others. The other thing you'll notice is one of those graphs is showing contamination of the pollen that's pulled from a cotton bloom. And it drops almost completely within 24 hours, and it makes perfect sense because a cotton bloom only blooms for 1 day. So when we pull that sample 1 hour after spraying, those anthers have been directly exposed to spraying. The bloom that's open the next day where we pulled our samples is a brand new bloom. It was closed the day before. So we can take advantage of these kind of scenarios to help preserve bees and reduce our impact.
So what else do farmers need to know, and what can they do?
Well, I think one thing they need to recognize is that they're being challenged. They're being challenged by environmental groups, legislative groups on how they use pesticides. Some of these activist groups are pretty active and they're pretty well funded, and they're trying to challenge the ability of farmers to use certain insecticides. And so I think they need to be involved on their end to make sure they have the tools they need for pest management. At the same time, they need to recognize that some of those concerns of the beekeeping community, of the activist groups about negative impacts on pollinators are real, and there's definitely things we can do to reduce our negative impact on these pollinators in general. One thing I think is to be aware of the problem, and that's why we're here talking about it. You know, you need to be aware that this really is a big issue that's driving policy and potentially can have long-term impacts on what pesticides you use or how you use those pesticides. So be aware of the problem. The number one thing we need to do, particularly when we're talking about honeybees, is communicate with our neighbors, in particular the beekeeping neighbors, and also communicate with the applicators. We have farmers that don't necessarily make the application on their crops. They have somebody hired to do that. So when we talk about pesticide application, it needs to be communicated not only at the farmer level, but to the pesticide applicator level, and then at the beekeeping level as well. And we can coordinate a lot of things to improve those relationships. I think the most important thing is to develop a relationship with your beekeeper and actually become neighbors and friends with them. It solves a lot of problems on the front end. You know, it can be a simple phone call like, I'm going to plant this crop here. Probably don't want to put your beehives right next to this because we're going to have to spray this a lot. Or, hey, we're fixing to spray this. In some cases, the beekeeper may be able to close up those hives temporarily to protect his bees, but it's really about communication. Some of the biggest problems I've seen is a lot of times we don't communicate until something bad happens. And then everybody's mad, right? A beekeeper's lost some hives. He goes up to the grower and says, gosh dang it, you killed my bees. And the grower's very defensive and it starts off on the wrong foot. Whereas I think if you have that good relationship going in, those things, first of all, aren't going to happen. And when they do happen, they resolve themselves better because you have a relationship. I think there's a couple of other things we can talk about, and I've already mentioned one, timing your spraying, thinking about things like wind direction. If there's a apiary, you know, a whole bunch of colonies of bees close to the proximity of your field, the edge of your field, you want to make sure when you spray, your drift isn't blowing right into that hive because that's obviously can have a pretty significant negative impact. You can spray later in the day in those circumstances to prevent some of that exposure. And in some cases, it's not often easy, but there are pesticides that you could use that may be less impactful or less dangerous to the bees than others. And we take advantage of that when the opportunity arises. I can tell you more farmers are getting aware about this. I'll get calls every year, people asking me, what could I spray because I have this apiary next door, and they want to make sure they don't cause problems, not only for the beekeeper, but ultimately it causes a problem for them.
The standard advice is read the label, but sometimes labels can be a little hard to understand, particularly relating to these pollinator protection statements.
Yeah, and they are, and the label's kind of a big document, and you know, you really do need to label it. There are restrictions for some pesticides about how you can apply them, and in fact, the new thing that's showing up on more and more labels is the bee icon, and it's literally a diagram of a bee that draws your attention to restrictions related to pollinators. And I think you'll see on your screen a screenshot from a product called Centric, which is thiamethoxam, a neonicotinoid insecticide that has that bee diagram on there, and it's pointing out some of the restrictions related to applying Centric in relation to pollinators. And there's a confusion a lot of times about the wording, and I'll give EPA a little credit. Sometimes I think it's almost intentionally a little bit confusing to leave some wiggle room. But if you read some of the statements that'll be on your screen, one of the first things it says, and this is, for example, to be relevant to cotton or to soybean, is it says, do not apply this insecticide anytime blooms are present and bees are foraging, which is a problem, right? Because we need a lot of times to apply insecticide during the blooming windows of cotton and corn. And I think a lot of people stop there and don't see some of the exceptions that allow us to make these applications. I think it's important to understand those. Some of the exceptions are pretty obvious. It's cold out. You know, if it's below 50 degrees, the bees aren't going to be foraging, so you don't have to worry about it. That's an exception. There's exceptions for, like, if you're on spraying malathion for mosquito control, for human health reasons or something, and things like that. The one exception that allows us to spray Centric during bloom potentially is it says you can do so. If you don't, it's going to cause you yield loss. Essentially, you've got a pest problem and you need to spray it. Those restrictions can be different depending on the crop and the scenario. So the one I got on the screen is showing you a scenario for, say, cotton or soybean. If you're an almond grower and you've got a contract with a beekeeper and he's got a bunch of hives around your field, there's a whole nother level of responsibilities there. There's more on that grower to protect the bees of that beekeeper, and there's specific language related to farmers that are applying insecticides when they also have contracts with beekeeping service providers.
What responsibilities do beekeepers have in protecting pollinators?
Well, that's a great question too, and I think everybody has responsibility, and one of the key responsibilities of the growers was to communicate with the beekeepers, but that's obviously a two-way street, and beekeepers need to communicate with their growers. A lot of beekeepers are actually using the crops of a producer for their food. In fact, oftentimes they're putting their hives on a grower's property, and they make that arrangement, of course, but I don't want the communication to be, hey, do you mind if I put bees over here, and that to be the end of it, because I think it needs to go far beyond that. I think you need to have discussions about where those colonies are going to be placed. If they're going to be in higher risk areas, you might want to move them or develop some kind of communication system like, hey, we're fixing to spray this field with product A, and that grower might, again, have some opportunity to close up his hives for a short period of time. You know, just good cordial communication can go a long way to eliminating some problems. I think another thing beekeepers need to do is do a good job of managing their hives. Don't be part of the problem. One of the big issues, and everybody pretty much agrees with honeybees, is it's not a big issue. It's multiple issues that are causing health problems, and pesticides probably aren't at the top of the list. You need to make sure you're managing your pest, your varroa mite, and you need to do it legally. Unfortunately, we have a lot of beekeepers that make off-label applications for varroa mites, and they often kind of accuse the growers of doing things they shouldn't do with pesticides, but we see that beekeepers often, because they're struggling with their own pest problems, are making treatments with things they shouldn't. Follow the label, follow approved procedures for making treatments for your pests. That's very important. If your bees need to be fed, make sure you feed your bees. Don't take too much honey in the fall. Make sure they have enough honey left over for the winter. And most people, beekeepers would know that. Certainly big beekeepers would know that. But sometimes you rob too much food, guess what? They run out of food before they get to the spring. For those folks that are doing commercial beekeeping and maybe transporting their beehives for pollination services, be very aware that's a very critical window. When you truck bees across the country, across the state, those bees are under stress. You know, it can be too hot, they're in close proximity, so there's opportunities for disease transmission. So you need to try to mitigate those effects. But again, I still think the biggest number one thing we can do to mitigate these effects is just good common sense approach to how we apply pesticides, how we manage our bees, and then communication between beekeepers and the pesticide applicators.
Are there resources available that will help beekeepers and applicators communicate?
There are, and there's probably a lot of things you could Google, in fact, and in some states they've actually developed essentially a coalition of all the stakeholder groups and developed standards, essentially standards of behavior. We've tried to do that in Tennessee, but it's not quite been finished off yet, but it's really all about communication and sharing information back and forth, making sure that the farmers and the applicators know where hives are at, making sure there's that opportunity to communicate and everybody has the right phone number. So that's available, but there's also some online resources. So for example, the Tennessee Department of Ag is promoting a program that's really available nationwide called Drift Watch, also called Field Watch. The Drift Watch is really a component of Field Watch. And what that is, it's an opportunity for beekeepers to go in and log in an area exactly where their beehives are at, and then growers, cooperating growers, would go in and do the exact same thing. So you'd be able to see where beehives are in association to certain crops that are in the area. You can go in there and actually notify people that we're fixing to spray this field right here and make a notification through the online system. So I think there's a lot of opportunity. It is voluntary right now, so it's not mandatory. But I think there's opportunity for that to grow. Ultimately, who knows, it may become a kind of mandatory system.
So last question, can bees and agriculture coexist?
They always have, right? And in fact, I say they should, they almost have to. They should be compatible. And certainly for some of our crops that require pollination, there's a need for coexistence, and that should happen. Even for the crops that don't require pollination, we've always had bees in our environment and been able to manage that. I sometimes wonder whether beekeepers and farmers and pesticide applicators can coexist, because this does become often very much a political, environmental argument. And sometimes facts don't enter into it anymore. But I think, again, stressing the communication part, that if you develop good working relationships in your geography, you can coexist. And try to stay out of the national, international fray of people that may not be even representing your interest.